He survived war zones, led military intelligence operations, and served his country for 30 years. But on a quiet street in Georgia, a white cop saw none of that, only the color of his skin. One traffic stop, one trigger. And the bullet that hit Major Terrence Boyd didn't just tear through flesh, it tore open a nation's conscience. What followed wasn't just outrage, it was a reckoning that rewrote the law. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. It was supposed to be just another peaceful afternoon drive, the kind of day where the sun glinted off windshields, birds chirped lazily in the trees, and the roads felt more like ribbons than arteries pulsing through a city. But in a blink, the illusion of calm would shatter. And on a sleepy boulevard just outside Savannah, Georgia, the line between duty and danger, between bias and brutality, would be crossed by the very person sworn to protect it. Colonel Terrence Hall didn't see it coming. He rarely did. 30 years in the Army had trained him to read danger in the eyes of enemies, not neighbors. Certainly not from the familiar hum of a patrol cruiser crawling up behind him as he drove through his sister's neighborhood, clutching a box of fresh beignets and humming to the tune of a John Coltrane track on the radio. He wasn't in uniform, just a man in jeans and a crisp white shirt, on his way to deliver dessert and laughter to two nieces who had been counting down the days to his visit. Terrence had survived ambushes in Kandahar. He had led operations in Fallujah. He had comforted soldiers in makeshift tents and stood on tarmacs to salute the flag-draped coffins of his men. He knew fear, real fear. He just didn't expect it to come for him in the form of Officer Craig Denton, a young, newly transferred cop with a chip on his shoulder and a history buried deeper than the ink on his badge number. From the moment Denton saw Terrence's out-of-state plates, something shifted in his mind. A black man in a high-end vehicle in a quiet white suburb. He didn't need dispatch to tell him that was trouble. He trusted his gut, the same gut that had never been formally trained, never questioned its own assumptions. He didn't know Terrence, didn't recognize his face from a military ceremony, didn't see the quiet dignity in the man's posture. All he saw was difference. All he saw was a threat. So he followed. Terrence noticed the lights only after making a complete stop at the intersection of Azalea Drive and Lafayette. Red and blue flashed like a silent accusation in his rearview mirror. He pulled over without question, calmly, engine off, hands on the wheel, just like his father had taught him, just like he had taught his own son. This was the drill. Stay composed. Stay alive. But something about this stop felt different. He sensed it in the stillness of the air, in the way the officer's boots hit the pavement too hard, too fast. He watched Denton approach through the side mirror, the man's hand already near his belt, eyes locked with suspicion before a word was even spoken. Terrence spoke first. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there an issue?" No greeting, no explanation. "License and registration," Denton snapped. Terrence complied. Slowly, deliberately, narrating every motion as if he were back in a combat zone. "Reaching for my wallet in the console. grabbing registration from the glove box. The air was tense, heavy. Denton snatched the documents, barely looking at them. His voice dropped, low and sharp. "You from around here?" "Visiting my sister, just a few blocks away," Terrence replied. "Name?" "Angela Hall." Denton scoffed. "We'll see about that." He stepped back, ran the plates. Nothing. Clean. Hall sat still. Didn't touch the radio. Didn't reach for his phone. Just breathed. Measured. Controlled. But his heartbeat, trained as it was, betrayed him. There was something in Denton's demeanor. A kind of aggressive curiosity. Not the kind that wants the truth. The kind that hunts for a reason. Any reason. And when none appeared, he made one up. "Step out of the car," Denton ordered. Terrence hesitated. "Is there a problem?" "I said, out of the car. Now." His tone left no room for trust. Hall opened the door slowly, carefully. He stepped out with the quiet precision of a man who had disarmed bombs for a living. Hands still visible, shoulders straight, no sudden moves. But even that wasn't enough. The moment stretched, taut and electric. A gust of wind stirred the oaks. Somewhere, a dog barked. Terrence looked Denton in the eye and saw nothing behind them but fear dressed up as authority. He wanted to speak, wanted to say, "Let's not do this." But the words never came. Because the officer's hand was already on the grip of his weapon. What followed was not a misunderstanding. It was a moment scripted by centuries, rehearsed in neighborhoods like this for generations. The story was old, the players knew, but the ending was as familiar as it was tragic. Except this time, the man bleeding on the pavement wasn't just anyone. This time, the man had friends in Washington. This time, someone was watching. And this time, the world would not look away. What happened next would ignite headlines, spark fury, and force a reckoning that could no longer be delayed. But it began here, on a quiet street, with a loud assumption. One man's bias, one man's breath, one trigger. A soldier who survived wars abroad had just been brought down by a war at home. And it was only the beginning. Under the golden afternoon sun in Savannah, Georgia, the scent of salt water mingled with magnolia trees as residents wrapped up their day in quiet contentment. On a tree-lined residential road, not far from Forsyth Park, Major Terrence Boyd, a decorated Army intelligence officer, had no idea that his peaceful drive would soon erupt into a life-changing encounter. The previous moment, a calm stop, a cracked window, hands resting at 10 and 2, had been the picture of trained discipline. Terrence had done everything right. That didn't matter. Because on the other side of that car door stood someone whose sense of power had already crossed the line into something darker. Officer Brent Holloway wasn't new to the force, but he was new to this town. Transferred just 6 months ago from a precinct in rural Alabama after a string of complaints that were quickly buried in paperwork and departmental jargon. On paper, he was a clean officer. In practice, he carried more than a badge. He carried suspicion. When he saw Terrence, he didn't see a man returning from a base, didn't see decades of service stitched into the stillness of his posture. He saw a threat where there was none. And as he approached the vehicle with his hand hovering near his holster, it wasn't protocol guiding his steps. It was something else, something more personal. "License and registration," Holloway barked. Not a greeting, not a request, but a demand. His voice wasn't loud, but it was charged with the kind of tension that made people flinch. Terrence met his gaze steadily, responding calmly. "Of course, officer." "May I ask what this is regarding?" There was no response to the question, only a harder stare, a twitch of the jaw, silence stretching between them like a tripwire. What was supposed to be a traffic stop had already turned into a test of obedience, not law. Holloway wasn't looking for compliance. He was looking for submission. And when Terrence, composed and respectful, failed to cower, something in Holloway's demeanor shifted. The situation didn't escalate because of raised voices or erratic behavior. It escalated because Terrence remained calm. That calmness, that refusal to play the role Holloway had written for him, was perceived as defiance. "Step out of the vehicle," Holloway ordered abruptly. No explanation, no warning. Just a sharp command slicing through the quiet street like a blade. Terrence hesitated, not from resistance, but calculation. He knew how quickly hesitation could be interpreted as threat. But he also knew the weight of history, the lineage of stories where men like him followed orders and still ended up face down on pavement. He slowly opened the door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible. Still, he was treated like a suspect in his own skin. Holloway circled him, gaze sweeping his frame like he was expecting danger to materialize from thin air. "You military?" he asked, eyes narrowing at the insignia subtly engraved on Terrence's watch. "Yes, sir. Army intelligence. Stationed at Fort Liberty." "You don't act like any soldier I've met," Holloway said, his voice laced with something venomous. "Just trying to get to my sisters," Terrence replied evenly. That was the moment Holloway's posture changed again. The shift was slight. A step closer, a tilt of his head, a lowering of his voice. "You think you belong here? In this neighborhood?" That question wasn't about protocol. It wasn't about verifying identity or checking for violations. It was about drawing lines, imaginary ones carved by prejudice. It wasn't the badge talking. It was the man behind it. Holloway wasn't enforcing the law. He was enforcing his perception of who belonged where. When Terrence reached slowly into his blazer to retrieve his phone, after announcing his intention twice, it was met not with understanding, but panic. In Holloway's mind, his assumptions had finally found a shadow to latch onto, even if reality never gave them shape. And in that instant, the air thickened with the terrifying silence that precedes irreversible decisions. The crack of the shot broke the quiet like shattered glass. It wasn't until Terrence collapsed, clutching his side, blood seeping through his charcoal blazer, that the reality began to settle. He hadn't lunged. He hadn't threatened. He had moved with the cautious precision of a man trained to de-escalate. But in the eyes of a man who had already made up his mind, that caution looked like danger. The truth is, Holloway never saw Terrence. He saw a narrative he'd carried long before he ever put on that uniform. As neighbors began to emerge from their homes, phones raised, eyes wide, the facade of legitimacy began to crumble. There was no weapon, no erratic behavior, no signs of aggression, just a man, calm and measured, now lying on the pavement, his body fighting to stay alive under the soft rustle of autumn leaves. A siren cried in the distance, too late to stop the bullet, but just in time to witness the aftermath. This wasn't about policy anymore. It wasn't about training or reaction time. It was about the difference between enforcement and profiling, between service and suspicion. It was about a man who followed the rules of both his country and his conscience, and an officer who followed the rules of neither. And as the ambulance finally arrived and paramedics bent over Terrence's body, the weight of what had happened began to pull the quiet little street into the orbit of something far bigger. The cop had followed protocol, maybe. But somewhere between protocol and prejudice, a man's blood now stained the asphalt. And America was about to ask itself, again, how many times it would need to see this picture before the answer changed. Under the sterile lights of the trauma center at Memorial Health University Medical Center, the hours dragged like years. Terrence Boyd lay unconscious, blood drained from his body faster than the doctors could replenish it. His uniform wasn't present, but the scars on his chest and calluses on his hands told the story of a man who had given 30 years to the nation he trusted. And now, that trust lay broken on an operating table. By midnight, word had traveled beyond Savannah, not as a whisper, but as a tremor. The name Terrence Boyd first appeared in a brief local news ticker. Army officer shot by Savannah police during traffic stop, critical condition. But the headline didn't stay small, because someone recognized the name, and then someone else. Within hours, it wasn't just the local station following the story. It was CNN, MSNBC, and eventually the Pentagon. At Fort Liberty, where Major Boyd had spent the last decade in intelligence briefings and high-level mission planning, the corridors of command grew quiet as the news broke. General Myra Hensley, who had mentored Boyd since his early promotion days, took the first call at 1:37 a.m. Her response was not emotion, but movement. She issued orders. She called Washington. She initiated a full incident assessment. It was personal now. By sunrise, America was no longer sleeping. Not just because of the name Terrence Boyd, but because of what it revealed. Again, another black man, another traffic stop, another officer's fear, anger, assumption. This time, it wasn't a gang member. It wasn't a suspect. It was an Army officer with top security clearance who had briefed senators, who had taught at the National Defense University, who had medals tucked into a drawer he never showed off. And yet, in the eyes of one man in uniform, none of that mattered. The video footage, captured not by the officer, whose body cam had mysteriously gone dark, but by a neighbor's doorbell cam, circulated within hours. It showed Terrence standing calmly, hands up, moments before the shot. It captured the voice of Officer Brent Holloway yelling "gun," despite no sign of one in sight. It showed Boyd falling. It was enough. Enough to break something loose in a country exhausted by waiting. The protests began not in anger, but in mourning. In Savannah, candles lined the sidewalk outside the hospital. In Fayetteville, North Carolina, where Boyd had raised his children, neighbors gathered in silent vigil. In Chicago, New York, Oakland, and Phoenix, veterans held framed photos of Boyd, not in uniform, but laughing, holding his grandchildren, handing out meals at a shelter. They wanted the world to see who he was before a gun decided he was something else. And still, the questions came. Why was he stopped? Why was he treated like a criminal? Why was the officer's first instinct to shoot? Why did none of his training recognize the humanity standing before him? A nation once desensitized to tragedy suddenly found itself cornered by the clarity of this moment. Terrence Boyd was not unknown. His name was in defense intelligence databases, on mission rosters, on commendation reports. He was official. And yet, the uniform he had taken off hours earlier meant nothing in the eyes of Officer Holloway. Civil rights groups mobilized. Veterans associations, once hesitant to join conversations about policing, found a common cause. They rallied not just for Boyd, but for every black service member who'd been pulled over, questioned, profiled, even in their own country. The headlines shifted. Army major shot. During routine stop, Pentagon demands accountability. Decorated officer treated like a threat. Why training wasn't enough. Service and skin. Why race still decides who lives and who doesn't. In Washington, pressure mounted. Congressional leaders issued statements, some cautious, some outraged. General Hensley addressed a closed-door panel with the House Armed Services Committee. Her words were deliberate. Major Boyd represented the very best of our command structure. If he is not safe in our streets, then we have failed more than just him. We have failed the foundation of this republic. But it wasn't just the military speaking now. Faith leaders, teachers, musicians, athletes, all added their voices. What began as a single shooting became a rallying cry for deeper change. For Officer Holloway, silence closed in like a cage. The footage disproved his version of events. His report failed to mention Boyd's military status. His bodycam failure was ruled a violation of protocol. Internal Affairs opened a case. The mayor of Savannah issued a formal apology to the Boyd family. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. Because something had shifted. Boyd's story wasn't just one more injustice. It was evidence that not even honor could protect a black man from bias. That no amount of medals or patriotism could erase a single officer's prejudice. That sometimes the battlefield isn't overseas. It's the very country you swore to defend. In an emotional interview outside the hospital, Boyd's daughter Maya spoke quietly into a sea of microphones. My father believed in this country. He taught us that service meant something. He thought if he was disciplined enough, calm enough, lawful enough, he would always come home. He was wrong. And that was the moment the silence shattered. Because for millions watching at home, those words hit too close. It wasn't just Boyd anymore. It was the fathers they knew, the sons they raised, the husbands they loved. It was every rule-following black man who'd been told respect was enough. Everyone who'd learned the script, hands on the wheel, no sudden moves, always polite, and still ended up on the ground. This wasn't just tragedy, it was betrayal. And in that betrayal, a new question emerged. If Terrence Boyd couldn't survive a traffic stop, then what hope did anyone else have? America, at last, looked in the mirror. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't look away. The courtroom didn't feel like justice. It felt like tension stitched into the air, heavy and suffocating. Savannah's historic courthouse, usually a quiet edifice of law, had become a crucible. Its old stone walls holding the weight of a nation's expectation. This wasn't just about Terrence Boyd anymore. It was about whether the American justice system could look itself in the eye and tell the truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable, even when it wore a badge. Officer Brent Holloway sat at the defendant's table, a uniformed ghost of himself. Gone was the steel-jawed confidence of the man who once patrolled suburban neighborhoods with authority. What remained was sweat on his collar, fingers trembling beneath the table, and eyes refusing to meet the woman seated across from him. Danielle Boyd, widow of Major Terrence Boyd, flanked by their two sons in tailored black suits that didn't hide the grief etched into their expressions. District Attorney Marisol Garner opened the trial with a voice that didn't rise in volume, but in purpose. She spoke of service, of sacrifice, of honor. Then she pointed to the defendant and told the jury plainly, that man didn't see any of those things. He saw skin before service, color before character. And because of that, Terrence Boyd bled out on a Georgia street holding nothing more dangerous than a phone. The jury was diverse: middle-aged, young, black, white, Latino. Some looked like they had served. Others looked like they had once been stopped like Terrence, quiet, cautious, unsure if the wrong glance might cost too much. They leaned forward, brows furrowed, as if trying to make sense of a story that had happened too many times before. The prosecution's case was built on precision. They laid out the timeline minute by minute, presented the footage captured by the doorbell camera across the street. The moment Terrence stepped out with hands open, the flash of confusion, then the shot that dropped him mid-sentence. Garner called forensic experts who testified to the angle of the bullet, straight through the abdomen at close range, no defensive wounds, no movement that suggested threat. Then came the audio, the words that cracked the courtroom in two. "You don't belong here." A neighbor's cell phone had caught it, muffled but unmistakable. Officer Holloway's voice, laced with a contempt that wasn't part of any training manual. It was raw, unfiltered, and chilling. The jury shifted in their seats. One older black juror shook his head slightly, lips pressed thin. In that single sentence, the prosecution's central argument stood firm. This wasn't fear. This was bias wrapped in authority. Then Danielle Boyd took the stand. She didn't cry, not in front of them. Her voice wavered once, but she steadied it. She spoke of a man who built his life around protecting others, who ironed his uniform even when off duty, who sent nightly texts from war zones that read, "Tell the boys I'm proud." She described the morning he left to visit his sister, cupcakes in hand, and how hours later she received a phone call, not from him, but from a nurse who used the word unresponsive too many times. "My husband wore the American flag on his shoulder for 3 decades," she said, eyes fixed on the jury. "But that day, all Officer Holloway saw was a threat. My boys will grow up remembering that a man who followed every rule still didn't make it home." Cross-examination tried to poke holes. The defense, led by attorney Paul Murnane, argued protocol, claimed confusion. "It was a high-stress moment," Murnane said repeatedly, as if stress could explain away everything. He brought in use of force specialists who tried to reframe the incident through training guidelines. "Officers are taught to respond rapidly," they said, "to prioritize self-preservation." But it rang hollow, because the jury had already seen the footage. They'd heard the tone, and they knew there was no shout of warning, no attempt at de-escalation. Just a gun, just a shot, just a life stolen. The defense made its final play with character witnesses, fellow officers who described Holloway as dedicated, principled, vigilant. But under cross-examination, one of them let slip a story about an incident 2 years prior. Another stop, another black man, and another complaint that had mysteriously disappeared after internal review. The courtroom froze. Garner didn't need to say more. The silence said enough. Finally, Officer Holloway took the stand. He looked smaller than his badge ever allowed him to be. His voice was strained. He said he was sorry, but not for what he'd done, for how it had turned out. "I thought he was reaching," he repeated. "I thought I was in danger." But there was no conviction behind it. Not really. Not when the jury had already watched a man calmly state, "I'm reaching for my phone," before collapsing to the pavement. In closing arguments, Garner didn't plead. She didn't lecture. She reminded. This was not a moment of confusion. It was a moment of clarity, a moment that revealed what happens when power lacks accountability. Terrence Boyd was not a stranger. He was a soldier, he was a father, and he was a citizen. And if he can be gunned down for holding a phone, then what justice are we even talking about? When the jury retired, the courtroom stayed full. No one wanted to leave. They sat in the quiet, heavy with truth, unwilling to look away from whatever came next. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about validation, a recognition that sometimes telling the truth in court takes more courage than pulling a trigger. After 9 hours, the jury returned. The foreperson stood. In the matter of the state of Georgia versus Officer Brent Holloway, we find the defendant guilty. Danielle Boyd closed her eyes. One son held her hand. The other leaned into her shoulder. There were no cheers, just quiet breaths and tears too long held in. The truth had been spoken, in full view of the law, in full view of a country watching. And now it had a name, Terrence Boyd, not just a victim, not just a hashtag, but a man who finally, even in death, was seen. When the sun rose over Savannah weeks after the verdict, the air felt a little heavier, not with grief, but with meaning. The kind that doesn't vanish after the headlines fade or the cameras turn away. Major Terrence Boyd had been laid to rest beneath a canopy of Georgia oaks, a folded flag placed gently into the arms of Danielle Boyd by trembling hands that knew the weight of both honor and loss. But something greater had been set in motion, something not even death could silence. Danielle didn't disappear into mourning. She channeled it. She founded the Terrence Boyd Foundation just 30 days after the sentencing. Its mission was simple but profound. Advocate for policy change, support families of service members impacted by racial violence, and ensure that no one wearing a uniform would ever have to die proving their worth. Donations poured in. Veterans, teachers, mothers, college students. The foundation wasn't built on pity. It was built on purpose. In Washington, his name echoed through halls where so many others had been forgotten. Congress introduced the Boyd Act, a federal initiative mandating national body camera activation standards, stronger transparency in police stops involving veterans, and independent review boards for use of force incidents. The bill bore his name, but it carried the stories of many. On the Senate floor, a junior senator from Illinois stood and said, "Major Boyd gave this country his loyalty. He deserved its protection. This legislation is one small step toward fulfilling that promise, for him and for everyone who looks like him." At Fort Benning, where Terrence had once trained young cadets in tactical resilience and calm leadership, a new auditorium was named in his honor. The inscription at its entrance didn't mention how he died. It focused on how he lived. Major Terrence Boyd, a leader defined by courage, character, and conviction. Let all who serve remember, strength begins with compassion. His former students, now scattered across units nationwide, gathered quietly in groups that week, sharing memories not just of their teacher, but of a man who led with quiet strength and listened more than he spoke. Back in Savannah, children at a local school held an essay contest on justice and integrity. The winner was a 12-year-old girl named Naomi, who wrote, "If Major Boyd was still here, I'd tell him I want to grow up like him. Not because he wore a uniform, but because he never stopped believing that people could be better." Her words were printed and framed. They hung inside the foundation's small but growing headquarters, a converted community center painted in soft blues and grays. decorated with photos of Terence not in combat gear, but in everyday moments, hugging his sons, laughing with Danielle, planting trees behind their church. And those trees, how they grew. One of the first events hosted by the foundation was a citywide planting in Terence's name. Volunteers dug deep into the soil near playgrounds, parks, and community centers, placing saplings into the ground with hands both young and weathered. They called it the Boyd Grove, a living memorial across Savannah where shade could one day comfort others as Terence had comforted so many in life. Each tree bore a plaque with a single word etched into the metal: belonging. Because that's what had been denied to him, and that's what would be reclaimed, not in anger, but in life. Danielle visited one of those trees often, just blocks from where it all ended. She didn't always speak when she sat beneath its branches. Sometimes she just listened, to the wind, to the children playing nearby, to the silence that, for once, didn't hurt. And when reporters came around asking for one final quote, one last piece of the story, she offered this: "My husband didn't need revenge. He needed remembrance. He needed this country to see him fully. And now it has. If even one officer pauses before pulling that trigger, if even one citizen speaks up when something feels wrong, then he's still doing his duty, even now." Terence Boyd may have been buried in the soil of Georgia, but his legacy had taken root everywhere else, in laws, in conversations, in classrooms, in the hands that planted trees, and the hearts that carried his story forward. And in every corner of America where someone paused just long enough to see the humanity standing in front of them. That was his legacy, and it would grow in the light.